two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Glyn Robbins, a British union organizer and also an academic researcher. And he is actually in Ithaca at the moment, which is how I found out about him. So I have introduced you in very general terms. Perhaps you could say a few more words about who you are and what you do.
I'm a lifelong trade union member and activist, working lifelong. Actually, I think some of you would recognize me as a red diaper baby as well. I was kind of born into the movement, so I didn't have a lot of choice. My working life for over 30 years has been in the housing field, particularly social housing, however we're defining that term. And I'm now, after 30 years working sort of at the coalface of housing, I've recently, actually, while I've been in Ithaca, began a contract. I'm now a lecturer in housing and urban policy and sociology at London Metropolitan University in North London. I'm a Londoner, and I'm teaching undergraduates about, I suppose, the importance of housing, particularly for working class people, particularly at a time of deep housing malaise. And that's also partly what brings me to Ithaca, because I'm researching a book about somebody who I think has something to teach us in terms of how labour unions can and should respond to the housing misery that millions of working class people are now suffering at the hands of the failing capitalist housing model.
And do we need that kind of information and inspiration here in Ithaca, which was recently some outfit said the most expensive small city in the country for housing?
Well, I hesitate to tell you about the place you live in that I've spent the last 4 days in and never been here before. I do increasingly think that we need to start referring to housing as the new global pandemic, because it's almost everywhere I go now. And I don't mean to be flippant in saying that, because actually people are dying as a result of poor housing.
Here too.
Yeah. And so I sort of half expected that housing would be a bit of an issue here, because it's a bit of an issue everywhere. But obviously, and I've got a bit of a sense for these things, I'm realizing that it's a very big issue here in Ithaca. I've read some of the stuff from the new mayor and how he intends to prioritize housing. I have some questions about what he might be planning to do on that front, but maybe we can get into that. I'm aware that there's a lot of anxiety about homeless people. I'm aware I haven't actually managed to find it yet, although I gather it's behind Walmart, the jungle. So you obviously have a serious housing problem, even in a relatively small city. And I think it just illustrates, well, the bloke who was serving me my breakfast the other morning in this hotel said, well, we're like a microcosm of America in terms of all sorts of things, but including housing.
So perhaps you could say a little more about why you are here in Ithaca right now.
I spent all of this week walking up the hill from downtown Ithaca to Cornell University, where I've been, thanks to a grant that I got from the British Society for the Study of Labour History, to go to the Keel Centre. It's a fantastic place. I mean, I'm not quite sure what the history is, but it's astonishing to me that a kind of elitist so-called Ivy League university, has this amazing archive of trade union history there. And that's what I've spent this week doing. And what I've particularly been doing is the research for a biography that I'm planning and writing and intend to publish about a fellow called Abraham Kazan. And he was one of millions, I suppose, a Jewish immigrant, arrived in New York from Imperial Russia in 1903, got work in the garment industry, became a trade union activist, and then almost had a Damascus moment around cooperativism and the idea of building and developing housing co-ops, and in particular, that trade unions should play a prominent role in doing that. And so although not many people have heard of him, which is part of my motivation for writing the book, if you go to New York City today, and I'm sure some of you are aware of this, there are around 40,000 homes in the city which are, well, let's put it this way, far more affordable than the market is anyway, probably about a third less. And they are the product of Abraham Kazan's work and that of the labor movement in New York, especially in the 20s. And then there was a lull during the Depression, and then they really exploded in the post-war period and culminating in the building of Co-op City, which people may have heard of. It's in the Bronx, and it's the biggest housing cooperative in the world. And I'm not saying we can easily go back to that. There's a lot of things have changed, but I do think it illustrates two things. One, that we're not condemned to eternal housing misery. Two, that trade unions need to be getting more involved in fighting for their members, not just to have good conditions at work, but also to have good conditions at home.
I've known people who lived in Co-op City, and also, well, I myself used to live in New York, not in any of these cooperatives. But so have been quite aware of another development, Penn South,
Right.
and my sister-in-law lives there.
As does Abraham Kazan's daughter. And I'm planning to go and meet her next week back in New York City. She lives in Penn South.
Which, by the way, has the distinction that it has its own generators. And during several years ago, there was, I think, a hurricane or something. I can't remember which one. And like the electricity was out all over the place in Penn South.
And I think the same is also said about Rochdale Village, which is another of Kazan's developments, or the United Housing Foundation actually was the trade union group that developed this housing after the war. In Rochdale Village, which is in Queens, I believe they say the same, that during, I think, either that storm or another, everywhere else was black, and they kept the lights on. And that's just another part of, I suppose, the principles that Kazan was trying to develop, which is that, we want to build the best quality housing for working class people. And it's not just about an affordable rent or shared equity rent. It's about services, and it's also about a cultural life that goes with it. Now, a lot of this stuff has kind of diminished over the years. Somebody I know called Ed Yaker, who's the treasurer of the first limited equity housing co-op in New York, which is called the Amalgamated, is also in the Bronx. The Amalgamated, after the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, they sponsored the first development, and it's named after them. And Ed's always saying, well, the spirit of cooperativism has been killed by television, shopping, and the car. And he's got a point. We live far more personal, privatized, consumer-orientated lives now than people used to. But I'm not sure that that's how people want to live. I think it's that capitalism has kind of forced us into that model. And again, I feel that our trade unions should be doing far more, not to just go along with that capitalist consensus and start to really get on the front foot around housing, because otherwise it's just going to keep getting worse, and it will get to a point where it's going to become very, very difficult to, if it hasn't already got to this it's a bit like the environment. You get to a certain point and it's going to be too late. I don't think it's too late for housing, and obviously the environment and housing are very closely linked issues, but we really need some action, and it needs to be tenant-led. And there's some brilliant housing campaigns here in New York that I've been involved with in the past, Housing Justice for All, and I know the DSA takes this seriously, although again, I know there isn't always agreement about tactics, and that's fair enough. But most of all, we really need to insist that our politicians do something, and trade unions need to be playing a part in that. And at the moment, and I'm speaking both about here, but also about where I'm from, trade unions are just sitting on the sideline when it comes to housing issues.
Which is so silly because trade unions, well, they have political clout. It's a huge, I mean, yes, they can fight to get better wages for their members, but then if all that money just flows into landlords' pockets,
Right.
it isn't.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, we started trying to campaign around this in my union back home, and we were trying to say, look, housing is now a workplace issue. The amount of money that our members are having to spend on rent and the way that the housing situation is affecting their lives, you need to think of this in the same way as you would any industrial issue. But we haven't really made that connection as far as the trade union leadership is concerned. But I suppose you could say that about a lot of things.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned environment also, and here, of course, well, you mentioned that some people are just camping out despite very harsh conditions. But what is more usual is that they just find a place to live that is very far away and can only be reached by automobile. And every commute pollutes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it doesn't just pollute the environment. I think it also pollutes people's lives in the sense of how much time do we expect to spend getting to and from work? How much money do we expect to spend getting to and from work? Go back to Kazan. It was very much part of his vision to build homes, Penn South being a good example, that were in the center of the city so people could walk to work. Most of the people who lived in most of the development, certainly in the early phases, worked in the garment industry in Manhattan, and they could either walk to work or get a relatively short bus ride from the Bronx, probably. And these days, and Britain's a lot smaller than this country, about the same size as New York State. But I know of people who are commuting an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. And the reason they're having to move away so far from their workplace is because they can't afford the housing. And this is ruinous in all kinds of ways, personally, but also I think socially and collectively. You think about the ability of people to play a role in their communities. You can't do that if you're dislocated from where you work. If you're a social worker or a teacher or a bus driver, people end up being very atomized, and that's a real problem. But I think at the same time, we need to recognize, as with other aspects of the housing crisis, this is the way capitalism wants it. There's no accident about this. This is what they want. If you read Engels in 1872, the housing question, he anticipates all of this minus the commuting and the vehicles. The way that capitalism has enchained us through housing and traps us, and also, of course, and going back to the trade union issue, makes it very, very difficult, all of the above, for people to get involved in their trade union, to get organized and have the energy, the confidence, the capacity to take industrial action. And again, this is all part of the plan from the point of view of the capitalist landlord class.
Well, and also commuting, what we tend to lack here is good public transportation in a rural area like this. When I lived in New York City, I remember commuting by subway, and on the corner of my desk at home, I had a little stack of magazines and newspapers and, you know, whatever, Xerox copies of articles or something, things that I planned to read while I was commuting.
Okay.
So I got some of that time back, but if you're driving, you
Yeah, you
can't
can't do that.
read. And I
No.
know people do who drive a lot have, listened to recorded books and things, but I don't think that's safe.
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe they're hoping, or they, whoever they are, is hoping that Elon Musk may be hoping that when we have driverless cars, everyone can, as was predicted in the 50s, would be able to sit in the car and play chess or read books or write poetry. I don't know. But, I think as with housing, I'm not trusting capitalism to be able to develop these things in our interests, only in their own interests. So you're right. I mean, housing and issues around health, issues around public transport, issues around the environment, issues around the education. There's a British politician back home who I would disagree with on almost everything, but he said all roads lead to housing, and he's right. All roads do lead to housing.
Yes. Well, could you say a little more about what you have what you have learned, or at any rate, what you know about what Abraham Kazan did?
Well, and it's important to say he didn't do it on his own. And I think, and again, this is sort of one of the key issues I want to bring out in the book and while talking about it is, he was part of a movement. He was a kind of, from what I'm beginning to glean, a sort of super bureaucrat. He was very modest. He didn't put himself to the forefront. He wasn't somebody who was, I've been looking through the archives. He isn't mentioned very much. He isn't in all the photographs. He did get some recognition in the end, and there's a street named after him in the Lower East Side. But essentially, as I say, he just got on with the job, and his job was to, as I say, develop 40,000 homes, almost all of which remain, if you like, outside of the capitalist housing market nexus. They're it's a limited equity model, which means essentially that people can't buy or sell their home for a profit. And so anybody who goes to live in one of those developments, whether it's amalgamated in the Bronx or Co-op City or Rochdale Village, there's another one called Peter Warbass, there's an interesting story about that because Peter Warbass homes is in Coney Island in Brooklyn. And when Kazan was developing that site, he came up against none other than Fred Trump, father of, and they had to cut a deal. Anyway, so there's these various sites around the city, Penn South as well, and they've stood the test of time. Now, I have to say, and Penn South is a good example. That this is not a perfect model, and there were victims because when Penn South in particular was being developed, they were part of an urban clearance program. Robert Moses, who I'm sure people are aware of, was the kind of, the master builder, as I think he liked to refer to himself. He was putting the strings on a lot of this. And Kazan was working with Moses. It was a slightly improbable relationship. But anyway, they worked together. And Moses, as again, people will know, was very committed to this idea of urban clearance programs, essentially.
Urban
And,
renewal.
urban renewal
That's what it was called here.
or Negro removal, in the words of James Baldwin. And when you look at the history of Penn South, what you'll find is that, yes, the housing was improved, the slums were demolished, the non-white Puerto Rican and African American community that lived there before was displaced. Now, that's a very familiar story, and it's one that endures. So I don't want to paint Kazan as a saint. I don't want to paint his housing as perfect at all, but I still think there's things there that we need to be aware of and learn from. And so I feel that he has that legacy. And as I said earlier, I think it's very inspiring to read some of the history because as I mentioned, it was also about a kind of flourishing cultural life. Now, a lot of that was oriented towards the Jewish community at that point in the sort of early part of the 20th century, and maybe has diminished over time, but it was also absolutely wedded to the trade union movement and to the left and to socialism. Now, within which, as ever, there was plenty of internal fighting and disputes, but nonetheless, the movement in the broadest sense was able to do this. And I feel that, we did it once, we could do it again. The comparison in Britain, which I'd like to just quickly mention, I've been involved for many years in an organisation called Defend Council Housing, and I worked as what you'd think of as a super on a council estate, which you might refer to as a project or public housing development, for many years. And council housing is something that I cherish and feel as proud of, actually, as a product of our movement in the UK, as I do of the welfare state and the National Health Service. All of the above are under threat at the moment and being chopped away. But council housing is, again, a bit like limited equity housing co-ops in New York, a model that we can learn from and go back to, but it isn't going to happen easily. We have to fight for these things as they have to fight for them in the early part of the 20th century. So council housing, when I was reading the Ithaca mayor's outline program, I wouldn't mind talking to him about it in a bit more detail, but I feel very strongly that that solving the housing crisis at any level, even at the level of Ithaca, if you like, has to begin with some form of public housing, because we've been trying to rely on the private sector and private developers and speculators to build the homes we need for decades, and it just doesn't work. And I'm sure that's part of the picture here. And so I would like it if the mayor was open to the idea of reviving public housing in Ithaca.
Well, it's problematic because if the mayor, if the city does something, they really only can raise two kinds of taxes, sales taxes and property taxes, which are taxes on housing. So it would make everybody else's housing that much less affordable if they did it within the city. What is the source of money for? I understand. You'd better explain what a British council is and then what their source of money is.
Well, I will do that, Theresa, but I think it's important to say I do understand the difficulties. In my mind, and it will relate to what I'm about to say about the British situation. This money has to come from Albany, and if it's not coming from Albany, it needs to come from Washington, DC. It's the same at home. You can think of a council as a bit like Ithaca City. It's a municipality. We have different forms of them depending on where you live in the country. I'm in London. We have 33 boroughs, as they're called, or councils. And councils historically have developed housing, enormous amounts of public housing, as you would term it. In the late 1970s through to the early 1980s, the significance of that date being the election of Margaret Thatcher, a third of the British population were council tenants. So there was, and this is another issue around, as you say, the problems, which is the stigmatization that has attached itself to public housing and council housing. That stigma didn't used to exist. It was aspirational, it was respectable. There was, if you like, nothing wrong with being a council tenant in the UK. Members of my family were council tenants, and my grandparents said to their dying day that when they became council tenants, it was the best thing that ever happened to them. Gave them housing that they would never have been able to get elsewhere. So the money is raised locally in each council. So some of that money would come from, if you like, Ithaca. But no, most of that money has to come from central government. And the way it needs to be paid for is by taxing the rich, basically. Because at the moment, we have a whole system of false economies around housing. Even in Ithaca, I would guarantee if we did the numbers, we'd find that the current situation is costing you all more them the potential solution, and we have a very similar thing going on back home, and we're trying to campaign again, unfortunately, not with the kind of help we need from our trade unions, and say to our government, look, this is costing us money. This is a false economy. We could solve this problem, but we do need investment from central government to enable us to do it. And I would say scaled down perhaps a bit, but I would say the same about Ithaca. But obviously Ithaca needs to be talking to Utica and Rochester and Buffalo, and all speaking in common cause about this, and getting down to Albany and getting to Washington and saying, we need some action.
Yes. Well, Ithaca has special problems that those other cities don't have to the same extent. And that is that so much of our property is tax exempt. I mean, Cornell and all the holdings that it has within the city are exempt from paying property taxes.
You're kidding me.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
everybody,
scandalous.
yes. We paid our property tax. We own our house. We paid our property taxes just a few days ago. The check for the year was about $4,000.
Okay.
And, it's I guess a medium-sized house, let's say. Anyway, so I guess what you are saying is somehow the money has to come from what's called a graduated tax, a tax that is based on ability to pay, not this sort of housing tax where if you have to get a bigger place because you have more children, you're going to pay higher property taxes.
Right. Well, I mean, I didn't know that about Cornell, and I'm sort of shocked. I mean, none of these things surprise you in a way, but they need to put their hands in their pockets and be told they're part of this city, they're part of this community. There's a problem. If they're not paying tax, then they need to start paying it in some way or another. They can pay a housing tax to make sure that everybody in the city is adequately housed. That's ridiculous.
State law. Well, thank you, Glyn Robbins. This has been interesting. I've learned some new things, learned more details about some old things. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.